This is a very special event, which is, I think you're all here because you know that we're discussing a very interesting document that's been put together about the future of Ukraine. And I just would like to thank especially the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for supporting this event. They brought the speakers here to us, and they've also provided the catering, the lunch. Yeah. So thank you, Raul, from the local branch of the, I think you're the local branch of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And thank you to Reinhard Krumm, who's here from the Vienna office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. This event is also co-sponsored with Carleton's Jean Monnet Chair in the EU's relations with Russia in the Eastern Neighbourhood, which is funded by the European Union Erasmus program. So these two organizations have joined together. We've provided the organizational support with thank you to Kathleen Schmidt, our manager, for getting this together. And I think it's a very unique occasion, although I should say it's not totally unique, because in October 2015, we did a similar event with Reinhard Krumm, who was here as well. I think you were there with 5 other speakers at that time, on the topic of the EU and the East in 2030. And this was another attempt to build scenarios for EU-Russia relations in that case, based on a kind of I don't know what you'd call it, a kind of workshop or study which had preceded that, which involved experts from a variety of different countries to think about where EU-Russia would be in 2030. Now today we've got a different topic, which is where will Ukraine be in, well, I guess it's 2026, 27. And so it's an exercise in imagination, and I think that's what makes it not only fun, but also very instructive. And so thank you very much to all of you for coming today to participate in this. I'm shortly going to turn over the floor to Reinhard, who's going to moderate the session and will lead us through the process. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to participate. But before I do that, I just want to mention, please keep your eyes open for other events for the Center for European Studies. We're a little bit quiet in the summer, but come the fall, we'll be running our usual series of lectures. So please keep an eye on our webpage. We have a variety of oh, they're mostly gone. I think actually all these got taken. There's a little booklet, but it's also on the website that relates to today's event, if you want to take a look at that later. So thank you very much again. I'll turn over the floor to you. And everybody enjoy. Have fun with your imagination and your, all sides of your brain can work here because we need your mind, your imagination, and hopefully a lot of optimism. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for taking the time. And the last row should tell me if I'm loud enough or not. I can speak up further, but I think it should be okay. Yes, it is true. We've been here before. We had this fantastic view over Ottawa, and it's delightful. I would like to introduce the panel at the very beginning. To my right, to your left, is Olexsii Semenii. He is the head of the Kiev Institute for Global Transformation. He's one of the members of the scenario team. And on my far right is Professor Nikolko. She is from this institute. She works here. She's a professor at the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. And she is a specialist in this subject, and we are very happy and very proud to have you, because she will comment. She will do the first comments on this. So the first harsh criticism will come from her. Oh. My name is Reinhard Krumm. I'm the head of the FES office, the Friedrich Ebert office, of the regional office for cooperation and peace in Europe, which is new. We just opened the office, and if you look at the name, it is kind of the same as the Olexsii, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, an organization with 57 member states. I don't know if the Olexsii is that known in Canada and Ottawa. It is basically the successor of the KSCE, and the KSCE was responsible for the final Helsinki Act in 1975, which was a marking, changing point trying to end the Cold War. And the organization still lives on, and trying in Vienna to do something about it. And our small organization, the office in Vienna, is doing the same. So I will lead you through, and I will do this in a very journalistic way. You know, the 5 W's: who, when, what, where, and why. And I'll introduce you to the project of a scenario endeavor. And it's really true what Joan said. One thing, scenarios are not, they are not a prediction towards the future. It is just gives us different ideas how the future could look like. The scenario team of 8, and you see them here, they agreed upon that those four scenarios which we'll present to you are possible. We are not saying this is what it will be, but we're saying it's possible. So who? You will see it here. There are 8 experts on Eastern Europe, on Ukraine, on European security from different countries, from the US, from Ukraine clearly, also from Russia, from Germany, from Slovakia. We decided to ask those people because they are very experienced in analyzing the situation, not entirely and only Ukraine, but in general Eastern Europe. When we had our first meeting in April 2016, where we invited more than these 8 people, and we had a long discussion on the methodology, on the topics, and I'll come to that. And we had the second meeting in October 2016, then in Vienna. The first one was in Potsdam, in Germany, the second one in Vienna. And then we kind of finalized those scenarios we'll talk about today. I can tell you we had heated discussions. We had people walking out, some came back. It was difficult, and we're not upset about this, and we're not upset about if you, during the discussion, criticize heavily. Hopefully constructive, because the topic is difficult. It's very emotional, especially in Germany, not to talk about Ukraine clearly and Russia. But what we're trying to do is find a way to look at things possibly in a different way. Scenarios is nothing new. I'm sure each of you has seen many scenarios. It's nothing new. It depends a little bit on the methodology, and it depends what you do with the scenarios. And I already told you where it was done, in Potsdam and in Vienna. But the idea of this scenario project is not just to give out the publication and then we tell the people in Kiev and Moscow and Germany. We've been also to Ottawa, and they were saying, ooh and ah. This is not what this is about. We're trying to have a road show, and this time we went to Washington, D.C. and to Ottawa. We have done stops in Berlin, in Brussels, in Kiev, in Moscow, and we'll have possibly 2 more in Prague and in Warsaw. These are countries partly of the EU, partly of the Eastern Partnership. Russia is none of it, neither is the United States or Canada, but you're all part of the OSCE. So out of the discussion we'll have later on, we make notes, and the best case would be to have a policy paper after all the discussions. And this would be a policy paper then hopefully for decision makers. Again, this is not the silver bullet, this is not something, okay, now we understand what to do. It's just one more step towards hopefully. There are many other ways to do this, but the Friedrich Ebert Foundation is a think tank, it's an NGO, and we believe that civil society should have a say in all this. One of our chancellors, Willy Brandt, once said, foreign policy is way too important just to leave it to the state. So I think society can do something about it. In comparison to the Cold War, you do have civil society clearly in Kiev and in other countries in Eastern Europe. Now the big question is what? So after this introduction and after explaining the methodology, we'll go to the 4 scenarios. We're working hard on it, first of all, to come up with names. So we thought they should all start with an A on the very top. We also made sure that we have illustrations, and we'll come to that. Not because we don't think this is serious, but we think it is very serious. But the question is, how do you come in contact with politicians? And just give them fantastic papers is not good enough. You have to give them a vision, and partly you have to give them a picture. So I'll show you later when the scenarios are presented the according picture, and you will see some are good and some are not so good. I hope fully the politicians will remember the good ones. The methodology. Scenarios are very tricky. If we would have 2 hours, we could make a scenario right here. We could say, what's the best one, what's the worst one, and then the middle one. And this usually works. And the good one is not taking place, the worst one hopefully neither, so it will be the middle one. So we, for the longest time in those 2 meetings, and it took quite a while, were thinking what are the factors which might influence the future of Ukraine. And we had over 80, I think, or 70, I can't remember, 70, 80, whatever comes to your mind, corruption, oligarchy, whatever. And also foreign issues, clearly financial issues. In Potsdam we came up with 2, and I'll show you how that kind of looks like. In Potsdam we came up with a strong and a weak state in Ukraine, and an aggressive and a more peaceful Russia, meaning you have domestic issues and you have foreign policy issues. But we weren't very happy with that. And during the second meeting, we decided then to say, no, we look at it from a very domestic point. Ukraine is clearly a subject of international law. It's sovereign as any other country. So why don't we look just at the factors which will influence Ukraine from within? Each scenario still, of course, looks at Russian influence, at the factor sometimes of the EU and others, but the main focus was to have a look at domestic issues. That's why we came up with state and strong and weak state, and social cohesion, strong and not so strong. And social cohesion is social capital, is trust, is the way a society is active or not active. Scenarios were managed and organized by a professor from Georgetown University. He has done this many times. He has guided us through this whole process. And basically it was the most difficult and the most challenging one, because you can imagine there are a lot of emotions finding those decisive factors. And if you come up only with 2, you have to throw away many others. And that was the heated discussion. But, and this is important with this kind of scenario approach, everybody, as I already have said, has to agree upon. So on the state and society, we got agreement, and that's why we went further. This gives us the possibility to have a structural analysis of the situation according to the scenario. So if you have 2 factors, then you have automatically 4 different scenarios, meaning a weak state and a weak society, a strong state and a strong society, and then strong society, weak society, strong society, weak state. And that's something which makes it interesting to build upon. So we had 2 people each writing 1 scenario. And within the group, as you can imagine, there were many quarrels. And then we showed all the scenarios to everybody in the group, and we came up with those we are presenting to you shortly. I can tell you that the discussions we had so far, in the first hour, almost in every country, was harsh criticism, especially because there was no foreign factor in there, especially Russia. After 1 hour, it changes. And there was more interest in, okay, these are domestic factors, and this is actually interesting, we should look into that. So basically at the very end we had a very constructive dialogue on that, and again I'm hoping we have that. You can criticize everything, we are very happy about that. I just want to make sure, please, if possible, be ready and open to accept these 4 scenarios. The first questions are always, oh, I have another scenario, why didn't you put that in? Yes, and you're right, and we make mistakes. But just let's assume we have those 4 we are presenting. Let's have the discussion around that. That is useful for a policy paper, and it is useful, I think, to also understand the logic behind it. And believe me, we put a lot of thought in. The whole project took 1.5 years. It is nothing we wrote within a couple of hours. This is difficult. And again, you can make completely different scenarios. We chose those, and we think they make sense, and possibly gives us a possibility to have a discussion which we have here in other countries. In Russia, one of the fairly high-ranking scientists said he could not remember that the topic of Ukraine was so positively presented in Moscow, and they took it. It was not any bashing, anything. It was, okay, let's look into this. How highly possible is that of this scenario? And clearly, there are some really bad scenarios. I'm repeating, we're not saying this is what will happen with Ukraine. We're only saying it's a possibility. And the last question before I come to the activist, which is the first scenario, why? Partly I explained. We have a serious crisis in Eastern Europe. Ukraine, the country, is in an extremely difficult position. This is all what you know, this is why you're here. And the question is, what can one do as an NGO, as political scientist, as historian, I'm an historian, to give some ideas to decision makers. And the longer you are in this, it's not really a business, but it's the longer you deal with trying to give advice to politicians, the more you understand how difficult it is for them in a time where this is not the only problem. I don't have to remind you of your bigger neighbor. The EU has many problems in itself. So this is just one of a couple. So first of all, you have to make sure that you get the ear of politicians, and we in Germany think, because we have a centralized position in Europe, Ukraine is very important for peace and security in Europe. How to give advice, how to give ideas. And we think this method, this idea, is one of many. But it's maybe something where a politician will look at because he likes it. He likes the way the scenarios are written. We invited a game designer to look over the scenarios to make sure that the story is not completely boring. So anybody can read it. And I'm not meaning that politicians need an easy language, but I'm just saying it has to be clear, comprehensible, readable within, I don't know, 10 minutes. So it's not only the topic which is interesting, it's also the presentations. That's why we have tried to have an illustrator to make sure that a difficult scenario is also visible as a difficult scenario. So the why is, we answered the question why with the importance of the subject we have, of the turbulences we have in international relations all over the place. We feel, I don't know if this is the same case in Canada, because you have quite a Ukrainian community here, a certain Ukraine fatigue, meaning, you know, we have a problem, it's not so bad, this is not my opinion, but you hear this, somehow it will settle at one point, so, you know, it's just a matter of time. We think it's not a matter of time. I think we have to be active and challenge politicians to come up. Something which we then didn't envision, even though it was clearly the case. In Europe, you have the changing of the guard. You have politicians who were active during the Cold War and after. They're kind of moving out of parliaments and out of governments because they're just simply too old. So you have a new generation of politicians, younger ones, which are very much appreciated, but some of them have never seen the Soviet Union and have never seen Soviet Ukraine, have never seen East Germany, have never seen the wall. So you have politicians coming in who have a different baggage than those who were acting before. And I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's just a case. That's how it is. So I think explanation about these crises is extremely important and will get more important. With this, I think I will stop. I will give the word to Olexsii, and he will present you the first scenario, which is the activist, which is clearly a positive scenario. So this is the introduction. We hear Olexsii with the two better scenarios, and I'm then responsible for the worse ones, but that's okay. After that, again, I'm repeating, we have the commentaries, and then we are very much looking forward for the discussion. And I'm repeating, your discussion, and I'm not just saying this because you're all sitting in front of us, is extremely important. We would like to have your comments. We would like to put some ideas into the policy papers. We're not using any names. And this is very unique, a presentation in very different countries, but countries who are kind of related either to Ukraine or to Eastern Europe or in general to European security. Thank you very much, and now please, Olexsii.
Good afternoon to everybody. This is quite interesting project. To some extent, it's unique. Exactly what Reinhard before explained. If we take, yeah, I will try. I will make it louder. First of all, the unique of this project is that actually we try to emphasize that many things with regard to Ukraine develops now or developed before. They are just more or less based on internal factors, not so much on external. Although we should understand that external factors, be it Russia, be it European Union, NATO, United States, of course, play and will play quite a huge role in the development of Ukraine. But if you take the whole discussions, be it public discussions or even expert discussions for the last 4 years, if you start something discussing on Ukraine or with regard to Ukraine, it always comes number one and two, all these external factors, and then you are stuck in some kind of tunnel from which you cannot go out. This project is some kind of attempt to reverse the angle a little bit. And this makes sense. You will see quite another perspective. All these 4 scenarios, it's not forecast. By forecast, you need some kind of scientific data, widely, definitely leverage. Foresight, it's about some kind of main highways which are really possible. If we take the current picture of Ukraine, none of the scenarios will fit 100% to current Ukraine. But in current Ukraine, for example, and in future, you'll find many elements from each of the scenarios, and then it depends, both first of all on Ukrainians and some kind of outside actors, which scenario actually will prevail, or which factors will prevail. So the other difficulty of this endeavor was not to come too much into details. For example, if for me, I was written together with Russian colleague one of the scenarios, namely the first one, for 3 or 4 pages to explain the scenario for Ukraine for next 10 years. It's very hard just to have this. On the other hand, not to be too much detailed, be it some date names, although you will see in each of the scenario, and this was an attempt to make it more, let's call it sexy, some dates, some names, some of the names we invented, just to make some kind of analogy which the way the Ukraine will go. Then I would see from me that Reinhard mentioned the FES discussion, is especially on the first meeting, was about external factor. But I would say that one more factor, it's taken about these major lines, could be also quite crucial, and it's not only for Ukraine. I would call it just technological changes. If we see what will happen globally and for many countries due to technological changes in 10 years, there will be definitely substantial changes, but nobody knows what will be exactly the way. You can only have some drivers of these changes. And then, just finalizing my remarks, we should also emphasize the importance of Ukraine now and for next 10-15 years for the whole European security. Now it's literally some kind of indication or centerpiece from which it's actually, or from the situation, how it develops in and around Ukraine, it actually quite a definite sign in what direction the whole security system of Europe on Euro-Atlantic will go. On the Y way, it could be quite negative, escalation. On the other way, if some solution or settlement could be found or will be found, it will be maybe positive path. So the first scenario is activist, it's low state capacity and high social cohesion. From my perspective, many elements of this scenario are now in place in Ukraine because of quite a good role of civil society, quite many attempts to promote something from the grassroots, not so much from the people in power, but some elements are from other. First of all, we see for the next 10 years in this scenario that it will be successful decentralization process. Apropos, it has already started in Ukraine, be it on legal level or on technical level, and this process will go to establishing some kind of regional clusters around such cities as Kiev, Vinnytsia, Uzhhorod, Poltava, Odessa, and Lviv. Whereas southern and eastern regions of Ukraine will profit a little bit more than other regions of Ukraine from this decentralization process. The second one, actually, we see active role of civil society, which will push forward reforms, especially on local level. Then actually, due to this decentralization or successful decentralization, there will be quite successful economic development. Although if we now, for example, mention there are no too many indices for such positive scenario, because Ukraine is one of the few countries in so-called post-Soviet space who never went beyond the benchmark, so-called benchmark of the level, let's call GDP level of 1990. I suppose only two another countries, be it Georgia or somebody else, did not overreach this benchmark. Moreover, after 4 years of war, we still did not reach the level of 2013. So from economic perspective, it's quite important when some kind of economic boost will come, and in this scenario we do see. And by successful economic development, Ukraine will, until 2027, be developed to some kind of model to many surrounding countries, actually from economic point of view. Although post-communist polity in country maintains actually paternalistic attitudes towards the state. So the problem will be still in place, but a little bit lessened. Then we see that until 2027, Ukraine will not be neither EU nor NATO member, although it will be closely aligned with both of the organizations. To some extent, it could be named of some kind, not multivectoral, but more or less quasi-balancing approach, having just wrong sympathy both to NATO and EU, but not being a member of these organizations. Then we will see, with quite actual topic to be discussed, Minsk Accords or Minsk Agreements, we see that it will be some kind of revision and modification of Minsk Agreements and start of real settlement of Donbass. Because now, if we take in even Minsk Agreements, it's not so much about the settlement, it's about ceasefire. And even ceasefire, and we do know, maybe all of us, is not actually in place, unfortunately, until now. And in the centerpiece, it will be some kind of UN peacekeeping mission which could start this settlement process. Then, and it was once more about the dates, and here probably we have already failed, because this prediction has been made in 2016, and at that time we predicted that this year, 2018, pre-term parliamentary elections in Ukraine will happen. Just from legal point of view, I could say to you, if the decision about this election is not taken until the end of June, they will not happen this year definitely, because there are some terms to be adhered. And okay, due to this prediction, new coalition and power structure will be formed, switching Ukraine to parliamentary model. Beforehand, it was always in Ukraine this switch from parliamentary presidential republic to presidential parliamentary, and it depended on personalities, coalitions. Here we see it will be once more switched to parliamentary model. In security policy, it will be start of constructive ambiguity model, de facto for the first period of time accepting de facto division lines with Crimea and occupied regions of Donbass, but on the same way supporting Donbass reintegration on some special status term for the first period to come. Then we foresee as well by late 2018, so this year, Putin will decide to give up rebel republics in order to revitalize its relations with the West, to boost economic growth in Russia, so it's about the sanctions, or lifting the sanctions maybe, and start normalizations with Ukraine. In general, these all three moves will lead us to start of so-called, by historical analogy, détente with the West. Then the next one, one more figure, one more name, invented by us, but for those of you who do know Ukrainian history, it will be not invention, but historical analogy. But in 2019, current President Poroshenko will lose presidential elections, and new president will be elected, namely, we named it Volodymyr Karmaluk. And actually, due to this new, I don't know, Smiles, who do know about the figure, but Ukrainians. A new power balance will be established on, once more, parliamentary Republican model. So it will mean less authorities for the president, limitations for so-called siloviki. So these are guys who are mostly devoted to special security services, to military, and to some other agencies where calling together, it's in Slavic language, siloviki as an aggregation for all of them. And it will be less influenced by far-right or even nationalistic elements. Then in 2020 election in US, a new president named Eric Garcetti from Democratic Party will be elected, and new constructive US policy will be in place towards actually Ukraine. Because now what I personally see, the US policy towards Ukraine is a little bit, let's say, ambiguous, although maybe its current policy of US is ambiguous to many other countries, but okay, this is actually the case. In 2021, we see start of DPR, LPR integration into Ukraine, but at the same time, some figures who are now currently there in power will be left for some period of time in place, just to have it like a smooth process, and they will be left in power or in some positions until mid of 2020s. Then in economy, we see Marshall Plan 2, which will be started for Ukraine, and therefore growth of FDIs and inflow, which will be aimed to key industry sectors and infrastructure development, be it software, airplane and space industry, mostly around such cities or clusters as Kharkiv, Kiev, Dnipro. Plus, FDIs will flow also to traditional, be it agriculture, machinery, or metallurgy sector. Then, due to easy access to EU markets and to some extent low costs still in place and in place in some years to come, these regions will be quite attractive for foreign investments because cost-benefit approach will actually prevail and make it positive. Then the next element, which is quite acute now, for example, for the last adopted law last week about anti-corruption court, namely corruption. Problem of corruption remains, but more or less accepted as part of doing profitable business, although civil society keeps corruption from spiraling out of control. Plus, anti-corruption authorities already, many of them are established in Ukraine, mostly will be quite effective. And then the last point, civil society and church, they will join their efforts to promoting quite positive policy inside of Ukraine, so reconciliation and building up cross-regional networks, making society more tolerant, so making it even much stronger than it is now, and to some extent successful, if necessary, in countering nationalistic groups in society. So it was scenario number one, called activist. Scenario number two, as said, it's about high state capacity and high social cohesion. Theoretically, the most positive scenario, but based on the current developments, be it inside or outside of Ukraine, I would say it is very positive, but to say today seems to be highly unlikely to be realized due to reality. But nevertheless, let's go through this scenario. First of all, we see that this year it will be just conflict or collision between Russia and US forces in Syria. We predicted some kind connected with airplanes, although I suppose in January we had this just direct collision between US forces and Russian forces near Deir ez-Zor, where actually some part of Russian so-called ЧВК, so armed forces not official, were just defeated and killed. Numbers differ from 100 up to 300 or even 400 soldiers of Russia. But we foresee there will be this collision, then dying some US and Russian citizens, and then the logic escalate to the escalate switch on. Namely, after this collision, it will come to US-Russia summit, or being Trump and Putin summit, and afterwards, actually, the Detente agreement will be in place, including, for example, such sensible element as removing for some time perspectives, or definite perspectives for EU and NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. Then it will be much more harsher pressure on Ukraine from the United States regarding reforms and fight against corruptions, and closely linked actually with financial assistance, which to some extent is already in place. If you see the whole discussion for the last 2 years, it is more or less already in place. Then due to this policy of so-called détente between the West and Russia, resulted in new security arrangements which are acceptable for major stakeholders of the whole process, be it Kiev, be it Washington, Moscow, and Brussels. Ukraine will be moving to status of neutral country, and military system will be based more or less on Finnish or Swiss approach, so some kind of self-defense and widely spread around the whole country. Plus, Allied's position in Ukraine actually will be much more consolidated, promoting the role of Ukraine as some kind of bridge between Russia and the West, and trying to make emphasis on quite successful and mutual economic links. Then we see one more figure, once more some kind of analogy affiliation. New president, we see in this scenario as well that Poroshenko will not win the next presidential election. The next president named Yaroslav Mudry. So actually it's prominent, real, very important for Ukrainian history, for Russian history as well. Historical figure, so he will be elected. He is former military officer, and in his campaign he promoted some another ideas as now are presented by political mainstream, and he will be elected next year, 2019, and it will shift the Ukrainian political model to parliamentary political model, which is have quite many elements similar to German political model, so much more powers for the parliament, less for the president. Then he will initiate constitutional reform in 2022. The reform will be implemented until the end of 2023, and the essence will be some steps undertaken. Firstly, the parliament will have 2 chambers. Now we have 1 chamber in Ukraine. Then there will be 2 chambers. Actually, let's call it House of Representatives and Senate, with symbolic presidency and quite effective decentralization. Whereas Kiev as capital will be responsible only for foreign policy, defense, higher education, macroeconomic policy, and actually provides guarantees for independent judiciary all around the country. Then it will be, in some one more element, the speech of this new elected president in United Nations General Assembly, which will focus on future for the sake of peaceful and prosperous Ukraine. He will promote also or put in place presidential initiative on Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Donbass, just to integrate previous adversaries, but if they testify before this commission. And he will succeed to change moods in society towards much more unity and reconciliation. Then he will also promote non-aligned or neutral status of Ukraine, which will be positively accepted by all major stakeholders, which is actually not the case today, and maybe will not be the case for the next years, but in this scenario it will. Then armed forces are reformed on the basis of territorial defense, which I told, on Finnish and Swiss models. And in response of all these steps taken together of Yaroslav Mudry, so new elected president, Russia began to withdraw its troops and implemented really Minsk Accords. And by doing this, Donbass will be fully reintegrated into Ukraine until 2027, while all regions of Ukraine will gain enough powers is due to decentralization effective process, making no special distinctions to Donbass, which will be reintegrated. Then, due to all these successes taken together, Yaroslav Mudry will be re-elected in 2024 and being as symbolic president with new constitution adopted. Then actually European values, so quite high agenda, will be more or less successfully implemented on all the process of 2 terms of Yaroslav Mudry, including consensus building, compromise, tolerance, reconciliation, and some kind of restraint. Then it will be some kind of stop of zero-sum games, which are actually very usual practice for Ukrainian elites for many years, even not mentioning from 1991, but even before, and it will be some kind of stop. They will become more responsible, and actually they will marginalize some kind of far link or far-right forces. Then it will be actually lessening conflicts between Orthodox churches, which should be quite positive because we do know how sensible the issue is. And in economy, this role of bridge between East and West, so between Russia and the West, will bring economic gains, and there will be just praising of these positive economic effects, be it in some economic institutions or be it in even some journals or some scientific publications. And there will be, especially for economic, as underpinning the whole process, idea of dispute resolution mechanism based on English common law. Then all this FDI inflow will impact quite positive change on macroeconomic dynamics. Therefore, many Ukrainian immigrants, which is now quite a huge problem for Ukraine, will come back to Ukraine, thus evaluating positive changes in their home country and actually growing incomes or salaries. Then we foresee that it's some figure once more that this sustainable economic growth of GDP will be actually around 7% of GDP growth annually, and thus it will just very quickly start of the process contracting gap between poor and rich, and actually making many incentives for Ukrainian citizens either to live in Ukraine or if they left Ukraine beforehand just to come back. And then the last element of this scenario, we will see that it will be a successful process of state service reform or civil service reform, which will be well paid and apolitical. So it was about 2 first scenarios.
Okay, now we're getting worse. You can see this. So now we are on the scenario 3, and 1, 2, 3 doesn't mean 1 is the best and 2. It's just how we structure it. So clearly, number 3 is the worst scenario, which means low state capacity and low social cohesion. So 2027, in this scenario, we envision a right-wing military coup. The new president will abolish any elections for the moment. The Donetsk and Lugansk region is there becoming quasi-states. There is a very low level, there is a low-level war with Russia going on, but it's going on, it's not going away. And the worst thing is, of course, a deep split society, partly looking towards the West, Western integration, Western modernization, and still there's part of the society which looks towards the East, looking for a different relation with Russia. So this is 2027, and always with the scenarios, then the question, so how do we get there? How come? Apparently, after the re-election of Poroshenko in 2019, this is the only scenario which foresees a re-election of the president we have right now in Ukraine. The decentralization which was envisioned by Ukraine is failing, and again it's become very centralized, which is not the wish of parts of Ukraine. They would like to be more independent within Ukraine. The rule of law is weak, not only in comparison to center and the regions, but also within the regions. There is a fragmentation of local authorities. Basically, that's why we call it a low state capacity. The state is not doing very well in enforcing law and order. And because of that, the socio-economic reforms which are badly needed are failing. So the population is kind of asking, so what is this all for? What are we doing here? There's also an understanding, which we might come up at the discussion, Georgia, but not only, are in transformation since 91, 92. And after the Maidan and the DCFTA, the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement with the EU and this association agreement, there comes a second part of transformation. So people ask themselves, are we a generation or 2 generations of transformation? So we're constantly under severe changes. And the state is not able to answer these questions, and the society in this scenario is too weak to call the state to do more. Another problem is that within the society, Ukrainians are willing to leave the homeland, going to different countries, trying to have a better education for their own children or just for themselves. So the classical brain drain is happening. And internationally it's even worse. Ukraine is seen from almost everybody as a buffer zone between the EU and Russia, which clearly is a bad thing for Ukraine. This is clearly the worst case scenario. And then the next one is called the administrator, and clearly it means that you have a high state capacity and a low civil society cohesion. Basically, this is a technocratic leadership which came to power in 2019 during the elections, which accepts the loss of Ukraine, of Crimea and the Donbass for the moment, not forever, clearly, nobody will do that, but for the moment, accepting the status quo to change the status quo. And this technocratic leadership goes for reforms within the framework what a country and a state can do under these circumstances. So they're trying to modernize agriculture and industry, not only heavy industry but also light industry. They're trying to make sure that the DCFTA and the association agreement EU is going well, but also they're trying, if there's any chance, to look towards the east, if there's any chance to have that customs union be in compliance to the Eurasian Economic Union. The goal of this technocratic government is basically to go for moderate economic reforms. They see this as the major engine for anything, for stability. They're also looking in improving socio-economic reforms in terms of healthcare, pension system, the whole shebang, whatever you have in that area. This is it. They're concentrating on that, and that would have not been possible before 2027. But through this government, they're trying to do this. The society is disillusioned. What I said before, the Transformation 1 and the Transformation 2, is you could say there are 2 generations of transformation. They're tired, they long for stability. They understand corruption will be fighted, but on a much lower scale and a much smaller or slower scale than it has been ever hoped for. And they see this as a long-term perception. Getting rid of corruption, that's what I mean. The younger generation is somehow pragmatic. They're also looking for stability. They're not very happy for a technocratic government. We had this during the discussions. This almost looks like a government which came into power in Russia in 2000. But the word stability all of a sudden has a different sound. It sounds much better than it used to sound. The reunification with Crimea is a long process, according to this government. It should happen, but it's not happening today. For the other countries outside, Russia, according to this scenario, is not any more interested in more escalation. It's where it is. The Minsk II agreement is partly implemented, partly not. But a peace mission will be installed. This seems to be something which this technocratic government can be proud of. We put something in which is already the first mistake. We opened with this. It was actually my idea. I like soccer, and I thought there could be a chance of a quarterfinal between Russia and Ukraine. But unfortunately, Ukraine didn't qualify, and Russia didn't have to qualify. So I thought this would have been a good twist on this. So this is the technocratical leadership. We call it the administrator. And this is it. This is number 4. And these are a couple of questions which we would like to present to you. You can ask, as I said, of course, any question you would like to have. But we are interested about foreign policy. We are interested in what you think, which scenario is the most likely Ukraine is in, which is the scenario which is possible, which is the scenario to be avoided. I mean, more or less it's kind of clear. But the question is that how to avoid it, and what to make, or what are the steps to make the better scenarios possible. Okay, but before we come to the questions, now we have the first criticism. And Professor Nikolko will share with us her view on the scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much I would like to present my view on this whole scenario, but I might also, I was questioning myself, can you actually free your mind? Or can I free my mind completely to follow these 4 scenarios? And I find myself, I failed. I'm still following the tracks that developed in ongoing situation. And particularly, I was asked to present on 2 major topics. One is what could be done about scenarios and my reflection on scenarios. Second, what I actually emphasize a lot on is Canadian perspective on what's going on in Ukraine and where we're standing now. What could we do better, considering the best scenarios, because that's where we're aiming, right? Talking about Ukrainian situation right now, we cannot avoid them from hybrid, right? If you want to be in the field, you have to use hybrid everywhere, but that's probably what's going to happen. The truth is going to be somewhere in between. But the clear trends could be found, and this is the idea of this intellectual exercise to provide us with some clear understanding what could happen if Ukraine will slide to one of these 4 directions. So first of all, please ignore this beautiful picture for a few minutes.
Louder, please.
Sure, yeah. So for the first part of my presentation, I would like to address some issue what I think might slip off the table in the scenarios. To be a critic is easy, right? So I'm going to enjoy this role for now, and then please help yourself to criticize my view regarding Canadian foreign policy towards Ukraine. So first of all, I think somehow very important topics slipped out of the consideration, such as migration in Ukraine, how this process is going to develop in upcoming future in 10 years, will be a significant factor for Ukrainian development. We continue, and another question, we continue to ignore economical factors as the core factor for Ukrainian development, particularly if you consider domestic problem of Ukraine. Moreover, economical factors of Ukrainian development proceed through the years. And as Professor Hafrelish mentioned, it's developed this angle on focusing on ideology and symbolic development of Ukrainian political system become obvious in the very early years of Ukrainian independence. In 1991, 1992, this situation regarding Ruch and Kravchuk, they were eager to find the new symbols for Ukraine, ignoring economical problems, and be persistent with ignoring economical problems in Ukraine. This is, I think, one model what could be emphasized a bit more in the scenarios. What kind of economical models Ukraine going to perceive this? How much they're going to be dependent on foreign investors? This is one of the significant, crucial problem of Ukraine, dependent on the foreign investor, direct foreign investment and remittances. It's in regards of migration, demographic situation, how much is going to change in 10 years? What is the role of women going to happen? And this is, I'm going to emphasize on this, there is no female leader among these four scenarios.
You put two in there.
Although,
First two.
although there's a picture, they actually, over there, lady, over there? I don't.
Two ladies.
Oh, two ladies.
And
oh.
two men.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ladies for positive scenarios.
Ah, okay, so, yeah.
Apropos.
Yeah. So generally speaking, how the, when you mention civil society, what groups are you talking about? Are there going to be some different changes in shifts in the representation of civic society? Because we know Ukrainian political party system is quite developed, but it's not functional. Because another significant problem of Ukraine is not just corruption itself in total or general, it's oligarchism. And I would call oligarchism as a factor of sustainability of Ukrainian system right now. And this is the issue could be addressed a bit more. Look at the way a Canadian scholar put it up to the way they're saying that oligarchism is actually substantial for Ukraine. And it developed and enrolled itself in the political system. It's much more than just talking about corruption on all the level of social society and political representation. Oligarchism right now is the same as Ukraine. And how are we going to deal with that? So this issue, I think, could be addressed. And in my way, actually, worst scenario is not there. Seriously, worst scenario is there. Conflict will develop in eastern part of Ukraine. Russia would not back up or proceed with the idea to control over the eastern and central part of Ukraine and maybe put into Ukraine a situation of absolutely failed, incompetent and unfunctional state. That's absolutely terrifying scenario, and I'm glad it's not there. I don't think it should be even considered, but as something like, you know, absolute the lowest point, it could be, we can use it as intellectual exercise. So how the Donbass conflict going to develop? You provide us in all four scenarios, I find it's quite positive model. Even if it stays as it is right now, it's a frozen model, it's still a bit separated from the dynamic of Ukrainian society. It's not that significant as it is right now in 10 years. So, talking about regional development, decentralization, and if it's going to up to the point federalization of Ukraine. When you're talking about regional development and decentralization, in the scenario number 2, you almost pronounce federalization, talking about the German model and two chambers of the parliament. Is it reality for Ukraine, or is it actually bonus for Ukraine, or is it threat for Ukraine? So we have to find the interesting model of the regional specific of Ukraine to keep this country functional and safe. So now I would love to provide you my view on Canadian perspective for this presented 4 Ukrainian scenarios, and maybe I'll put some questions on the table and suggest what we can do better in terms to keep Ukraine safe, sustainable, and developed in 10 years, and build up Ukrainian perspective as the most positive scenarios among heard. Okay. Oh, let's do the picture first. So beautiful picture. This is a great start, right? And it could be great end. But it's not that easy. So you can see in the middle it's our Prime Minister, and surrounded by 5 ministers from our cabinet, and they're all
together. And Olexsii, your comments I think were very insightful. I found them very helpful, and there were some new perspectives. And Milana, especially for bringing the Canadian perspective. I forgot to mention at the beginning, we do have a visitor coming later this summer from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Dr. Markus Keim, who's going to be co-teaching a course on European integration and European security with me in the second summer session. He'll also be giving a guest lecture. We don't have the topic or the date yet, but please keep an eye on our website. No doubt these issues in some form or shape will play some role in that discussion as well. So we welcome you back in the fall. Thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.